The fact that Assad fell so quickly with so little resistance, and after the regime in Iran had spent tens of billions of dollars, nearly $50 billion, and hundreds of thousands of its soldiers to prop up the regime. Indeed, it's fair to say that were it not for the support of the Islamic Republic, Bashar Assad would have fallen long ago. After such an investment of lives and of dollars, the regime is devastated by this loss. It's a significant blow to its confidence, and it continues to show that the Islamic Republic is weaker than it's been in its 45-year history.
And while many Syrians are delighted at the collapse of the Assad regime, one of the biggest losers from his overthrow is Iran. The country's leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, has accused the United States, Israel, and Turkey of being behind the fall of the former dictator. Iran poured money, weapons, and troops in to sustain Assad's government. But the so-called axis of resistance is now in ruins, particularly after the damage which Israel has inflicted on Hezbollah in Lebanon and Hamas in Gaza. Cameron Khansarinia is vice president of the US-based National Union for Democracy in Iran and joins us now. Good evening to you, Cameron.
Good evening to you, and thank you for having me on the program.
Well, good to have you with us. What do you think is the effect on Iran of the collapse of the Assad regime in Syria, next door to Iran, of course?
Well, this is a devastating blow to Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei. He delivered an address today, as you mentioned, in which he looked weaker and frankly, sadder and more despondent than I think many analysts and Khamenei watchers or Iran watchers have ever seen him. Syria and the Bashar Assad regime was one of the most important components of the Islamic Republic's axis of resistance after Hezbollah and Hamas were effectively decimated. His loss is a significant setback for the regime in Tehran. The regime in Tehran, including senior IRGC commanders, often referred to Syria as a province of Iran. It was so dear to them. It was such an important component of the buffer that they were attempting to build in the Middle East. And the fact that Assad fell so quickly with so little resistance, and after the regime in Iran had spent tens of billions of dollars, nearly $50 billion, and hundreds of thousands of its soldiers to prop up the regime. Indeed, it's fair to say that were it not for the support of the Islamic Republic, Bashar Assad would have fallen long ago. After such an investment of lives and of dollars, the regime is devastated by this loss. It's a significant blow to its confidence, and it continues to show that the Islamic Republic is weaker than it's been in its 45-year history.
We heard there that Ayatollah Khamenei said that the US, Israel and Turkey were all behind the fall of the former dictator Assad in Syria. But is there this sense in which Iran was so busy trying to prop up its other proxies, particularly Hezbollah in Lebanon, which was engaged until recently in that fighting with Israel, that Iran was preoccupied with the pressure on Hezbollah in Lebanon, and to an extent that allowed these rebel forces to sweep into Damascus and sweep Assad from power?
Well, first, as to Mr. Khamenei's accusations as to the reason for the collapse, to Mr. Khamenei, behind every trouble he faces, there's an American or British or Zionist conspiracy. He said the very same thing, for example, about the coronavirus pandemic. Just before he banned American and British-made vaccines, he said that COVID was an American, British, and Zionist ploy to undermine Iran and undermine the Islamic regime. So he thinks everything is just such a ploy and just such a plot. As to why this happened, as to whether Mr. Khamenei and his IRGC, their eyes were off the ball, as it were, in Syria, that's entirely one possibility. It's also entirely a possibility that despite the billions of dollars that they spent, tens of billions of dollars, and the thousands of lives that they sacrificed to defend and prop up the Assad regime, that even that investment wasn't enough. I think it's proof yet again that dictatorial regimes and tyrannical regimes and totalitarian regimes, even despite significant foreign support, cannot last against the will of their people. And I think that the moment that Khamenei finds himself in right now and why he's so worried about this is not dissimilar to the moment that the Soviet leadership found themselves in the late 1980s and early 1990s when they lost the Eastern Bloc countries, when they saw the fall of the Berlin Wall. And that very quickly led to their own lack of control at home. And shortly thereafter, the dissolution of their entire regime. And so I think that Khamenei sees the loss of these buttresses abroad as bringing the threat far closer to home and
But
indeed the existence of his regime being in question.
But there's no real sign, is there, that it's going to bring about the downfall of the Islamic rulers there in Iran? I mean, we've seen them brutally suppressing, for example, those protests by some women who refused to comply with the very tight rules on what they can wear in public and so on. And we know that the Iranian regime also locks up many of its opponents, many of its critics. There's no sign, is there, at the moment, of Ayatollah Khamenei and the Ayatollahs who run that country being forced from power?
Well, I would disagree with you, frankly. It may not be an immediate result of the fall of Assad. We may not see the regime fall tomorrow or in 2 months or in 3 months. And indeed, I don't want to get into a prediction game. I certainly don't have a crystal ball, or if I have one, it may not be a very good one to tell you exactly when this regime will fall. But the protests that you alluded to after the murder of Mahsa Amini were indeed only the most recent protest in a series of anti-regime protests, each of which came about for different reasons. Many of them were started by economic concerns, others by socio-political concerns, others because of indeed environmental challenges that people are facing because of regime mismanagement. So what we're seeing in Iran is day by day new sectors of society joining the movement against the regime and becoming increasingly frustrated with the regime's repression, with its total inability to provide. So Assad's fall may not directly lead in the short term to the fall of the regime, but what it does signify is that even against an incredibly oppressive regime, I mean, the scenes that we're seeing come out of Syria are shocking. And we see very similar scenes in Tehran's Evin prison and in prisons across the country. But because of the total mismanagement, because of the lack of alignment between the leadership of the government and the citizens, that even those most oppressive regimes can fall. And what we're beginning to see is not only new sectors of society turning on the regime, indeed, parts of what used to be considered the regime's base, even members of the armed forces were beginning to see defections, albeit at low to mid levels. But you do see members of the armed forces sending videos on social media, not showing their faces and saying that we side with the people, we don't side with the regime that's slaughtering our compatriots. So we don't know when it will happen, but I think that the fall of Assad and the fact that it happened in less than 2 weeks with this last offensive, and really not an armed struggle. There were very few shots fired, as we all saw. The Assad regime put up very little resistance, shows that the regime in Tehran is indeed much weaker and much more susceptible to collapse than any of us might think at this moment.
Cameron Khansarinia from the US-based National Union for Democracy in Iran. Really good to speak to you. Thanks so much for joining us tonight.